She sang where no one listened, her haunting voice lost in the roar of New York's subway tunnels, meant only for herself. Commuters passed by without a glance, never knowing they were walking past something extraordinary. But one man didn't. Keep walking. Stopped. He listened. And he happened to own a struggling record label. What began as a quiet moment underground would lead to a stage she never imagined standing on. The question is, when the world finally listened, would she still choose to sing for herself? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The first train of the morning had already come and gone, leaving only the faint rattle of metal fading into the tunnel. Maya stayed in her spot near the tiled wall, sitting cross-legged on a flattened piece of cardboard she had carried down from a delivery bay 2 nights ago. Her coat wasn't much against the damp air, but she had learned not to shiver. Shivering made people look she didn't want them to. A worn guitar rested against her side, its case long gone, the wood faded and chipped at the edges. She didn't play it often in the mornings. This early, she liked to hear her own voice without anything in the way. She waited until the echo in the station softened, then let her breath slip out in a long, slow note. It started quiet, almost under her breath, then grew as it rolled off the tiled walls, curling into the empty space between the flickering lights. Her voice wasn't trained. No one had ever taught her scales or breathing techniques. She didn't know the rules. But she knew how to feel her way through a song like a person feeling for the edge of a dark room. Each note she sang seemed to find its place without her thinking about it, as if the tunnels themselves carried the sound where it needed to go. She didn't sing for money. Sometimes coins would clink onto the cardboard beside her, dropped by a passing commuter who had paused for a few seconds, but she never asked for it. Singing for money felt like giving the wrong name to what she was doing. She sang because it was the only thing in her day that felt completely hers. No one told her how to do it. No one graded her on it. No one could take it away while she was in the middle of it. Down here, under the weight of the city, her voice didn't just pass through the air. It stayed for a while, folding back into itself in the echo. It made her feel like maybe she was still here too, even when no one noticed. A single paper. Coffee cup rolled across the platform, pushed along by the gust from a train passing on another track. Maya's song slid over it, her words catching in the cold air like thread on rough wood. The melody wasn't anything anyone would recognize from the radio. It was pieces of old songs she had picked up in different places, half-remembered lullabies. Scraps of gospel from a church service she'd once slipped into for the warmth. Verses from a jazz record she had heard through a doorway. She stitched them together into something that made sense to her, a language without translation. Footsteps clicked on the far side of the station. A man in a dark suit moved quickly, eyes down, phone pressed to his ear. He didn't slow as he passed, but his stride shifted slightly, like he was listening without wanting to be caught. Aya kept her eyes on the far wall, singing as if the platform were still empty. She had learned not to break the spell by looking at people. Looking made them remember they had somewhere else to be. The lights above her buzzed in uneven intervals, one bulb giving off a faint hum before flickering back to life. Her position on the cardboard, tucking her feet under her to keep them warm. Her voice dipped lower, softer now, more for herself than for the space. She thought of it as singing into her own hands, folding the sound up and keeping it safe. Somewhere above her, the city was already loud, traffic lights changing, horns blaring, conversations tumbling into one another on crowded sidewalks. Down here, the noise was different. It was in the metal and the wind, in the creak of the rails, and the heavy sigh of trains pulling into the station. Her voice found the spaces between those sounds, slipping through them like water through cracks. When the next train roared past without stopping, the tunnel filled with the low rush of air, scattering her hair into her face. She closed her eyes, holding the note until the wind passed, then let the song settle back into her chest. No one clapped. No one spoke. The platform was empty again, and she liked it that way. It meant she could start another song without having to pretend she was doing it for them. Stairwell was nothing special, just a concrete alcove where the smell of rusted pipes mixed with the faint sweetness of spilled soda. Commuters passed it without a glance, too focused on catching there. Trains, or avoiding the shadows. 4. Maya. It was the closest thing to a room she had. The space was narrow enough that she could sit with her back against one wall and stretch her legs almost to the other, kind of shelter from the wind that sometimes howled down the subway corridors. In winter, the cardboard she slept on wasn't clean, but it was dry, and that mattered more. She kept it folded during the day so it wouldn't get kicked around or draw too much attention. At night, she spread it flat and laid her coat on top. Pulling her guitar case now, only a hollow shell with the zipper broken close to her side. Her possessions fit into 2 small piles. One was practical. A cracked plastic water bottle. A backpack patched in 4 places. A roll of socks bound together with an old shoelace. The other was everything that still felt like hers, the guitar. With its worn fretboard, a notebook with the cover peeling at the corners, and a folded photograph of a woman sitting on a porch swing, smiling at something outside the frame. She never told anyone who the woman was. In her mind, the fewer things she named out loud, the fewer things could be taken from her. She didn't have a lock or a door, so her safety came from blending in with the rest of the station's quiet. Debris. People might notice a spill on the floor or a missing tile, but they didn't notice her if she stayed still enough. Sometimes the transit workers sweeping the platforms would nod to her, but they never asked questions. She preferred it that way. Questions led to stories, and stories led to pity, and she had no use for pity. When the noise of the city pressed, to close the rush of trains, the shouts of strangers, the static of too many voices, she would pick up her guitar and strum the same soft progression over and over. She didn't play for an audience. She played to build a wall of sound around herself, something warmer than the concrete and dim lights. When her voice joined in, it was almost like the stairwell changed shape, as if the sound gave it a roof and 4 solid walls. She had left home 2 years ago. Home was a loose word for what it had been, a 3rd-floor apartment where the windows never opened. All the way, and the air smelled of cigarettes and fried food. Her mother worked nights, mostly gone, and her stepfather drank until he turned into someone she didn't recognize. It wasn't the fights that drove her out. It was the silence that followed, the kind that told her nothing was going to change. One evening, she took her guitar and her notebook, stuffed what she could into a bag, and walked out without looking back. She never left a note. There was nothing to say. The first nights were the hardest. She learned quickly which subway stations stayed open and which ones locked up. She learned to keep moving so no one would think she was settling in too long. But she also learned the power of making herself small and unremarkable, of slipping into the places where no one bothered to look. The stairwell under the Midtown station had been an accident. She found it on a night when the rain had driven. Her underground earlier than usual was just far enough from the main flow of commuters that she could stay without being chased away, but close enough that the sound of footsteps reminded her she wasn't entirely alone. When she sang here, the notes bent differently than in the open platforms. They curled tighter, the echo softer, almost secret. She liked it. It was hers. Even when the train screamed past and the wind pushed wrappers into the corner beside her, she could keep singing, letting her voice push back against the indifference of the city. Out there, she was just another shadow. In here, she could fill the space until it belonged to her. The morning trains were always the hardest to sing in, not because of the noise or the crush of bodies, but because no one ever looked up. 7:30, the cars were already full, shoulders pressed together, briefcases and tote bags wedged between knees. The air smelled faintly of coffee, damp coats, and whatever cologne had been sprayed on too generously in a rush. Maya slipped into one of the cars at the end of the platform, careful to position herself near the door, where she had room to stand and hold her guitar. She had learned to start playing before the train pulled out. Once it was moving, people stopped noticing anything beyond the glowing screen in their hands. Her fingers found the first chord automatically. The sound bright but low enough not to jar anyone from their morning routine. She didn't introduce herself or ask for attention. The opening lines of an old Billie Holiday song rolled from her, mouth steady and warm, carrying just enough volume to slip under the murmur of the train. She didn't know when she had first heard it tonally that it had come from the cracked speaker of a radio in a tiny kitchen years ago, back when she had been living with Mrs. Hartley, a foster placement that had lasted less than a year but had given her more music than the rest of her childhood combined. Mrs. Hartley had loved jazz and soul, not the glossy remastered versions, but the scratchy vinyl records that crackled between notes. She would hum along while stirring soup or tap her slipper against the linoleum floor as she folded laundry. On the good days, she'd pull Maya into a slow dance in the middle of the kitchen, spinning her in awkward circles while singing into a wooden spoon. It was in that kitchen that Maya learned the songs she still carried, not the ones with chords that wrapped around you, the ones that didn't need perfect pitch to feel true. On the train, those songs were her armor. She could sing them without thinking, letting her voice move like water over stone while the city pressed in. Passengers barely shifted when she started. A man in a blue scarf scrolled through emails. A woman with earbuds in adjusted the strap of her purse without removing them. A teenager with a skateboard propped between his feet stared at the floor. The train rocked gently, the rhythm matching the sway of her voice. Maya never expected applause. In the mornings, her singing was part of the background, blending with the metallic groan of the tracks and the soft chime of upcoming stops. Sometimes people would glance at her briefly, as if checking what the sound was, then return to their own worlds. Once in a while, someone would drop $1 into the open pocket of her coat, but she never sang for that. She sang to remind herself. She still existed among all these moving bodies, to keep from disappearing completely into the blur of the city. Halfway through a verse, the train slowed, screeching into the next station. The doors opened, letting in a rush of cold air and more passengers. Maya kept singing, the guitar vibrating softly against her ribs. A few people brushed past her without meeting her eyes. She caught sight of her reflection in the darkened window thin, coat hanging loose around her frame, hair pulled back into a low knot. For a second, she looked like one of them, just another commuter, and the thought made her chest tighten. When the train started moving again, she shifted into another song. This one, a slower soul ballad Mrs. Hartley used to play on rainy afternoons. The melody curled around the space, soft enough that the man in the blue scarf looked up briefly, then back down. Maya focused on the music, letting each note carry her through the tunnel. Whether they heard her or not didn't matter. Were hers. And in the rush hour crush, that was enough. Daniel Hartman preferred the subway to the town cars. His assistant kept booking for him. He said it was because traffic wasted more of his time than he could afford, but the truth was quieter. Down here, no one asked him for anything. No one leaned across a table with a contract or slid a phone into his hand asking for a photo. The subway was where he could be another face, another coat in a sea of coats, and he liked it that way. This morning, the air above ground had been sharp with cold, the kind that turned breath into small clouds. So he had buttoned his long wool coat all the way up and pulled the collar high. He wore no tie, no watch, nothing that might catch the wrong kind of attention. The train smelled faintly of metal and wet concrete. Daniel stood near the center of the car. One hand looped casually through the strap above him, rocking with the rhythm of the tracks. His mind was already circling the problems waiting at his office. A touring artist whose album sales were sinking faster than projections. A distribution deal tangled in legal delays. The nagging suspicion that his label's golden years were. Behind it, he had built Hartman Records from nothing in the late 90s, scraping together enough for studio time with unsigned talent no one else believed in. But decades later, the business had hardened around the edges. Music felt different, now, liquor, quicker, stripped of the grit that made it matter to him in the first place. It was just as his thoughts had sunk into that familiar loop that he heard it, something threading through the usual noise of the car. It wasn't loud, not enough to demand attention, but it was there, steady and clear. A voice, female, young, without the polish of training, but with the kind of tone that made the hair on the back of his neck lift. It cut through the hum of conversation and the clatter of wheels like it belonged in the space between them, filling it without pushing. He shifted his gaze without moving his head. Toward the far end of the car, standing near the doors, a girl held a battered guitar against her hip. Her coat hung loosely around her shoulders, too thin for the season, and her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested she'd done it without a mirror. She sang without looking at anyone, eyes fixed on a point just beyond the floor, her fingers working the chords like she'd been born with them. The song was old. He recognized it in Pasisa jazz standard that had been reimagined 100 times since the 40s. Most young singers who touched it either drowned in its complexity or overworked it to sound impressive. This girl did neither. She let the melody breathe, gave it space. Every note landed like it was supposed to, not because she had studied it, but because she trusted it to fall where it needed to. Neil realized he was leaning slightly toward her, the way a person might lean toward a half-heard conversation. He didn't move closer. Part of him didn't want to disrupt whatever she was creating in that corner of the train. Passengers near her didn't seem to notice. A man in a black parka scrolled through his phone, lips moving faintly as he read something. A woman with a rolling suitcase adjusted her grip on the handle, her eyes glazed from lack of sleep. They were surrounded by sound, and yet somehow deaf to it. When the train swayed, the girl shifted her feet to keep balance, her voice never faltering. Daniel caught a glimpse of her face when she turned slightly to adjust her guitar strap. It was younger than he expected. 17, maybe 18. There was something guarded in her expression, not shyness exactly, but the kind of self-containment he recognized from people who had learned not to expect much from others. He thought briefly about walking over and asking her name, about telling her that what she had was rare, the kind of rare you couldn't buy or teach. But the moment felt fragile. She didn't know he was there, and if she did, she might stop. So he stayed where he was, letting her voice carry him through the tunnel as the lights flickered overhead. When the train pulled into the next station, and the doors opened, she stepped off without looking around, vanishing into the tide of passengers. Daniel remained in place, listening to the echo she left behind, already aware that something about her had followed him too. The last note hung in the air for just a moment before the train's brakes began their slow metallic whine. Maya didn't hold it any longer than she needed to. She let it dissolve into the hum of the car, her fingers still resting on the strings. As if reluctant to let go, no one clapped. No one said anything. A few passengers shifted in their seats, adjusting bags or reaching for the rail as the car rocked. She'd grown used to that. The absence of reaction didn't bother her. It was easier this way. She slid the guitar strap over her head, careful not to tangle it in the loose tie of her hair, and crouched to tuck the instrument into its scuffed body bag. The zipper was broken, so she folded the flap across the top, pressing it flat. With her palm, her notebook went in next, slipping between the neck and the strings. Everything she owned that mattered could be packed in under a minute. She'd timed it before, back when she thought she might have to leave in a hurry if a conductor decided she was a nuisance. Daniel watched from his place near the center of the car, one hand still looped through the overhead strap. Efficiency in her movements struck him no wasted gestures, no hesitation. She moved like someone who had learned that lingering made you visible, and being visible invited trouble. The moment the train stopped, she slung the guitar over her back, tucking it close against her side and stepped into the open space near the doors. Her eyes stayed down, fixed somewhere on the floor between her boots. The doors opened with a hiss, spilling cold air into the car. The crowd surged forward, the push and pull of bodies choreographed by habit more than awareness. Let herself be carried with it, slipping into the stream of commuters without brushing against anyone for longer than a second. Daniel tracked her movement as she crossed the threshold to the platform, disappearing almost immediately into the blur of coats and scarves. He stayed where he was, even as the space around him thinned. He could still hear her voice in his head. Not the lyrics, but the tone, the shape of it, the way it settled into a listener without demanding anything in return. It wasn't perfect in the technical sense. It was better than that. It was unguarded. The kind of sound that came from somewhere below the surface, deeper than practice could reach. He'd heard it only a few times before in his career, and always in people who hadn't yet realized what they carried. The train doors closed again, sealing the platform from view. Daniel didn't sit. He kept his eyes on the glass as the car moved forward, but the reflection staring back at him was just his own. She was gone, and he had let her go without a word. It unsettled him more than he expected. He'd spent years telling himself he could recognize potential instantly and act on it without hesitation. That was the skill he built his reputation on. And yet, when it had been there 3 steps away, he'd chosen to stay silent. He told himself it was because she was young, because approaching her in the middle of a crowded station would have been clumsy at best. But the truth pressed in from another angle. He hadn't wanted to break the moment. There was something about the way she sang, the way she didn't look at anyone, that made it feel like stepping into her space would have cost more than it gave. The train lurched into the tunnel, the windows flashing with the blur of passing tiles. Daniel leaned back slightly, loosening his grip on the strap, tried to let his thoughts drift back to the meetings waiting for him, to the deadlines and emails that filled his days. But her voice was still there, lodged under all of it, a thread he couldn't quite pull free. He didn't know her name. He didn't know if he'd ever see her again. All he knew was that in a city where noise was constant, she had left behind something that refused to fade. By the time the last of the evening crowds thinned, the station felt like an entirely different place. The rush hour heat, built from hundreds of bodies pressing past one another, had cooled into the damp chill that settled in after midnight.
The tiled walls
No longer swallowed her voice under the weight of conversation and footsteps. Now every sound lingered, curling around the columns and carrying down the length of the platform before dissolving into the tunnel's dark. Maya liked it best this way. She could stand in the center of the platform, feet planted wide enough to feel steady on the concrete, and sing without competing with the roar of the city. Her voice swelled and drifted back to her, doubled in the echo until it sounded like someone else was singing with her. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and imagine she wasn't alone, that there was another person hidden somewhere in the shadows, singing in perfect unison. In the mornings, the subway was all elbows and muttered apologies, the scent of coffee, seeping from paper cups, the cold indifference of people with somewhere else to be. She could barely hear her own guitar over the shuffling and the train's groan as it pulled in. But at night, the space belonged to her. The yellowed light overhead buzzed steadily, casting long shadows across the benches. A forgotten newspaper lay folded on one of them, its front page curled from the damp. Somewhere far down the platform, a metal gate rattled softly in the draft, a sound that marked the rhythm between her verses. She chose her songs differently after dark. The faster jazz pieces she used in the mornings gave way to slower, deeper melodies, the kind that let her hold a note until she felt it in her chest and spine. Tonight it was an old soul ballad, one Mrs. Hartley used to hum when the radio signal was too weak to catch anything else. It began low and steady, like a conversation spoken just above a whisper, and climbed slowly, pulling the air tight around her until she was singing into a space that felt smaller, more intimate than the vast platform. The trains at this hour came less often, sometimes 20 minutes apart, their headlights glowing faintly down the tunnel before the brakes shrieked and they rolled in, mostly empty. When one stopped, the doors opened to reveal no more than a handful of passengers, night shift workers, with tired eyes. Kids heading home from somewhere they shouldn't have been, someone carrying a takeout bag that perfumed the air with fried food. Most didn't notice her. A few nodded in passing, their steps quick as they crossed the platform to catch the next train. Maya didn't mind. The absence of attention was part of the reason she could sing freely here. There was no one to measure herself against, no one to decide if she was worth listening to. Each song was a conversation between her and the space itself. She could let her voice fall into the cracks in the concrete and imagine it seeping into the walls, leaving a trace that would still be there tomorrow, even if no one else heard it. When a train roared through without stopping, the rush of wind shoved her hair into her face and tugged at her coat. She kept singing through it, letting the note ride the gust until it faded into the tunnel. The echo came back softer, more fragile, and she caught it before it disappeared, folding it into the next line. This was the part she loved most, catching the sound as it returned, reshaping it, sending it back out again. By the time she finally stopped, the station was silent again, save for the faint hum of the lights and the distant drip of water somewhere. Beyond sight, she stood for a moment, letting her guitar hang against her side, and breathed in the cold air. It wasn't applause, but it was enough. Here, in the hollow quiet of the night platforms, she didn't need anyone to tell her she was worth hearing. The walls told her every time they sent her own voice back to her, whole and unbroken. Daniel sat at the end of the long conference. Table, a half-empty glass of water, sweating onto the polished surface. Listening to the latest numbers from his sales director, words drifted past him without landing streaming figures. International licensing delays, projected revenue curves. It was the same language he had been hearing for months now. Numbers. Tilted in the wrong direction no matter how they dressed them up. Hartman Records was no longer the name people whispered with anticipation. It was an aging brand holding its breath between trends, waiting for the next big act to save it. He told himself the Subway Girl had been nothing more than an odd flicker in an otherwise ordinary morning. A quirk of acoustics in the tunnel. It's the kind of thing that felt remarkable in the moment but faded under daylight. He hadn't even stopped. Walking, when she sang well, not really. He had listened, yes, but from a safe distance, 1 foot already in the next minute of his life. That was how you survived in this business. You didn't chase every voice you heard. You waited until someone proved they could carry more than a song. Still, her voice had stayed with him, threading itself between meetings and emails, or surfacing when he was alone in the back of a car or standing at the window of his office, looking out at the city. He could recall the texture of it, that unpolished clarity that didn't sound like someone trying to be heard, but like someone singing because they didn't know how not to. It reminded him of the first artist he'd ever signed, another unknown who had been singing at a friend's party. With no expectation that anyone important was listening, the gamble had paid off in ways no one predicted. But that was decades ago, before the industry taught him to measure risk like currency. Now, the stakes were different. Every signing had to justify itself in a spreadsheet. Every decision was weighed against quarterly goals and the patience of investors. Taking on an untested, unnamed singer with no following, no material, no proof she could handle the grind that wasn't vision anymore. That was recklessness. Daniel didn't have room for recklessness. Not with the numbers he had just seen. The more he tried to box the thought away, the more it seeped through. It wasn't just the sound of her voice that bothered him. It was the way she didn't seem to care who was listening. That kind of detachment was rare. Most singers he met were straining for approval before the first chorus, already shaping themselves into what they thought people wanted. She hadn't even looked up. He could have been anyone, and she would have sung the same way. He caught himself wondering what she might sound like in a quiet room, a real mic in front of her, the noise of the train stripped away. He imagined her voice filling the corners of a studio, unbound by the hard sway of a subway car. Then he pushed the thought aside again, telling himself it was a distraction. His calendar was already too full. His resources were already too thin. But that night, as he walked home, instead of calling for a car, the memory rose again. The city's noise faded into a blur, and he heard it the way her notes held steady against the rattle of the train. The way she shaped a phrase like it had lived with her for years. It wasn't ambition that had driven her, it was something deeper. And Daniel, despite himself, was starting to wonder if he had just let something extraordinary slip right past him. The morning had been colder than she expected, the kind of cold that settled into her fingers no matter how tightly she kept them curled in her pockets between songs. Maya had chosen a spot just inside the station entrance, where the rush of air from the street still reached her, carrying the scent of exhaust and damp concrete. Commuters streamed past in layered coats, boots tapping quick rhythms on the tile, their voices blending into the constant hum that was louder than any train. She'd been playing for nearly an hour, switching between the handful of songs she knew by heart, her voice steady but low, saving its strength for the moments when the space around her felt like it might actually listen. The man appeared between trains, during one of those rare lulls when the platform wasn't yet filling again. He was middle-aged, his scarf wrapped high around his face, a to-go cup in each hand. He slowed as he passed, his head tilting just slightly, like he wasn't sure if what he was hearing belonged to the station or to his own thoughts. Maya kept her eyes on the guitar, her fingers moving in the familiar shapes of a melody she could play in her sleep. When she finished the verse, he stepped closer. She braced herself for a question, or worse. A suggestion. People sometimes offered advice they thought was helpful, telling her to try out for a televised talent show, or to smile more so she'd get bigger tips. But he didn't say anything. At first, he just held out one of the cups. Steam curled from the lid. "It's hot," he said, as if she might mistake it for something else. Hesitated. Warm drinks from strangers were rare, but so were gifts without strings. He didn't seem in a hurry, though. His expression carried none of the restless impatience she usually saw in people moving through the station. Slowly, she reached for it, wrapping both hands around the paper cup. The heat bled into her fingers, easing the stiffness there. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice lower than when she sang. He nodded once, then glanced at her guitar. "Got a good sound," he said, not like he was making conversation, but like he meant it. Before she could respond, he stepped away, moving toward the platform just as the lights in the tunnel began to glow with the arrival of the next train. Maya didn't follow him with her eyes. She stayed where she was, letting the warmth seep into her hands before taking a careful sip. It was stronger than what she usually drank, bitter in a way that made her tongue prickle, but it was hot and it was hers. She took another sip, slower this time. Moments like this didn't happen often, but when they did, they stayed with her. Not because they promised anything big or not, because she thought they were signs that her life was about to change, but because they made the day a little easier to carry. The city could be sharp, full of edges you couldn't avoid. But sometimes it softened for just long enough to let her catch her breath. She set the coffee down at her feet and began to play again, the familiar rhythm of her fingers returning. Without effort, her voice was steadier now, the cold, less intrusive, around her. The crowd thickened as the next wave of passengers hurried through, eyes focused on the train. No one else stopped. That was fine. She didn't need a crowd to make. The moment mattered. The warmth in her hands was proof enough that someone, even briefly, had seen her. By the time the coffee cooled, she had moved on to another song, one she hadn't sung in weeks. The echo in the station caught the edges of her voice, and for a while, it was enough. Daniel didn't usually take the downtown line on Thursdays. His schedule had a rhythm to it, meetings in the Midtown office until noon. A quick car ride across the river for a studio check-in, then back uptown before traffic hardened into the slow crawl he hated. But that morning he left his assistant with a vague explanation about wanting to shake things up and walked past the corner where his driver usually waited. The subway entrance yawned ahead, cold air rising from below. He took the steps, 2 at a time, his scarf tight against his neck, feeling faintly ridiculous for what he was doing. It wasn't a plan, not exactly. It was more like a tug he'd been ignoring for too long. He told himself he was curious, that he wanted to know if she was a regular performer or just a fleeting moment in the city's noise. But beneath that was something. Sharper, restless edge that had been with him since that morning in the train car, when her voice had threaded its way past all the static in his head. He hadn't expected it to stick with him. Certainly hadn't expected it to pull him back here. The station was already thick with commuters, the air heavy with the mix of damp coats, too strong perfume, and the faint metallic scent of the tracks. Daniel kept his head down, blending into the crowd as best he could, scanning the platform without making it obvious. For a moment, he thought it had been a mistake. He heard nothing but the usual collisions of sound train brakes, hurried footsteps, a station announcement muffled by static. Then, just as the incoming train began to slow, he caught it. Faint at first, almost swallowed by the noise, but their line of melody, warm and unhurried. Rising above the mechanical grind, he stepped toward the sound without thinking, slipping into the third car from the front as the doors opened. Inside, the crush of bodies was immediate. Train was full. Everyone pressed shoulder to shoulder, the air warmer than the station had been. Daniel moved with the tide, letting himself be carried a few feet in before finding a place to stand. Near the door, and then he saw her. She was facing the opposite way, one hand looped casually around a metal pole, the other cradling the neck of her guitar. The strap crossed her back. The instrument tilted slightly forward so she could brush the strings with the edge of her thumb. She wasn't singing to the car. She was singing to the space itself, to the tunnel walls and the narrow air between them. Her voice carried over the hum of conversation, clear enough to reach him through the layers of bodies between them. Daniel stood still, his grip tightening on the overhead strap. From this close, he could hear the subtleties he had missed before, the way her notes bent at the edges. Not from uncertainty, but from intention, the way her breath seemed to shape the room without her raising her volume. She sang as if there were no one else here, as if she could peel away the train's metal shell and let the song spill out into the city above. The car swayed sharply as it took a curve, and she adjusted her stance with practiced ease, never missing a beat. A man beside her shifted to make room, though she hadn't asked for it. Most of the passengers didn't look at her. Few glanced up, then away, as if acknowledging the presence of music, but unwilling to linger in it. Daniel felt a flicker of frustration at that, how easily people could let something rare pass by without even seeing it. He stayed quiet, content to listen, not ready to make himself known. The song wound on, verse into chorus, the sound deepening as the train plunged further into the tunnel. When the next station announcement crackled through the speakers, she didn't pause, just let the rhythm of her strumming shift to match the slowing wheels. Daniel kept his eyes on her until the crowd shifted again, and he had to angle his body to avoid being pushed further away. He realized, with a quiet certainty, that this wasn't coincidence anymore. He hadn't stumbled onto her by chance. He had followed the sound, and now that he'd found it again, walking away was no longer an option. The train lurched as it left the station, a shudder running through the length of the car, but Maya kept her footing, her fingers resting lightly on the guitar strings. She had been cycling through a list of songs in her head, the ones that worked best for mornings like this, quick familiar rhythms that could slip into the noise without asking too much of anyone. But as the tunnel swallowed them, and the flickering lights painted the faces around her in flashes of white and shadow, she felt herself shift toward something else entirely. Her thumb brushed the low E string once, twice, drawing out a hum that seemed to anchor the space around her. She let the chord bloom slowly, as though testing the room, before her voice joined it, low at first, almost a murmur, the opening line of an old gospel piece she hadn't sung in months. It was a song she'd learned in the kitchen of Mrs. Hartley's apartment, back when Sunday mornings still meant something. Mrs. Hartley had played it on a battered upright piano, her hands heavy on the keys, the melody spilling through the open windows to the street below. Maya had memorized the sound before she ever knew the words. Now in the crowded train car, the first verse unfurled like it had been waiting for the right moment to return. The notes climbed slowly, each one steady, deliberate. The noise in the car softened almost imperceptibly, not because people were paying attention yet, but because they were hearing something different from the usual morning soundtrack of metallic groans and muffled conversations. Daniel, standing just a few feet behind her, felt it before he saw it. The subtle tightening in the air, the way voices dropped and heads tilted ever so slightly. He had heard thousands of singers in his life, but very few could do this, shift a room's temperature without raising their volume, command attention without asking for it. She moved into the second verse, her tone deepening, the faint vibrato in her voice catching the overhead light and reflecting it back into the silence growing around her. One by one, the distractions faded. A man who had been furiously typing on his phone let his hands fall into his lap. A woman near the doors pulled out one earbud and didn't put it back in. A teenager leaning against the pole lifted his head, his eyes narrowing as if trying to place the sound. It wasn't that they recognized the song, most of them probably didn't. It was that they recognized something in it, a quality that bypassed words entirely. Daniel watched the transformation with a quiet, almost reluctant awe. Even the train seemed to notice its rattling less intrusive now, the rhythm of its movement syncing in some unspoken way with the rise and fall of her voice. He could see the curve of her jaw as she turned slightly, the way her eyes stayed fixed on a point just beyond the glass, as though the song wasn't meant for the people in the car at all. It was for somewhere else entirely, and yet it claimed everyone within earshot. By the time she reached the chorus, the stillness was complete. The usual shuffling of feet, the coughs and sighs of passengers. Even the low murmur of side conversations had dissolved into nothing. It wasn't the stunned silence of a performance ending. It was the suspended quiet of people caught mid-thought, held in place by a sound they didn't want to lose. Daniel felt it in his own chest, a tightness that came from recognition, from knowing when you were in the presence of something that didn't happen twice in the same way. The final notes lingered long after her fingers stilled on the strings. For a beat, no one moved. Then the train began to slow, the platform lights sliding into view. The spell broke softly, like mist thinning in the sun. Passengers shifted, adjusted their bags, stepped toward the doors, but their movements were slower now, their eyes darting toward her as if reluctant to turn away completely. Daniel didn't move, not yet. He stayed where he was, the echo of the chorus still settling into him, aware that what he had just witnessed was rare enough to change the course of his day, and maybe more. Maya didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the pause she had created. She simply adjusted the strap of her guitar and readied herself for whatever the next stop might bring, as if she hadn't just silenced a moving train. The train lurched without warning, the wheels screeching as it took a sharper curve than usual. Bodies swayed in unison, a ripple moving through the crowded car. Maya's grip on the metal pole slipped just enough for her balance to falter. She stumbled sideways, the guitar pressing awkwardly into her ribs as her shoulder collided with someone standing just behind her. Daniel caught the weight instinctively, his hand steadying her arm before she could pull away. Up close, the contact lasted no more than a second, but it was enough for him to notice the way she tensed, not the startled flinch of someone unsteady on their feet, but the wary recoil of a person accustomed to guarding their space. She straightened, quickly adjusting the guitar strap and stepping back until the crowd closed between them again. "Sorry," she said, barely loud enough to be heard over the hum of the car. Her voice was different now, stripped of melody, just a quiet thread of sound meant to end the moment as quickly as possible. Daniel shook his head once, a reflex more than a reply, but she didn't look back to see it. She shifted her weight, clutching the strap of her bag with one hand, the body of her guitar with the other, as though holding on to both was the only way to anchor herself. He found himself watching her more closely now, no longer from the detached vantage of a stranger in a crowd. Her hair was pulled back loosely, strands falling forward as she lowered her head. But it wasn't enough to hide her face entirely. He caught a clear glimpse as the train passed under a stretch of brighter tunnel lights. Her skin was pale in that washed-out way that came from too many days in underground air. There was a faint hollowness to her cheeks, the kind born from skipped meals rather than choice, and a tightness at the corners of her mouth that spoke of long hours spent keeping expression in check. But it was her eyes that held him. They weren't wide or pleading. They didn't carry the brittle sheen of someone at the end of their rope. They were sharp, steady, and entirely awake in a way that jarred against the weariness and the rest. Of her features, there was something in them that refused to sink, like a small, unlit lantern that still somehow promised it would burn if given the chance. She shifted her bag higher on her shoulder, the movement practiced, protective. Daniel realized it was the same hand she had used to hold her guitar strap when she sang. Fingers curled just enough to keep the instrument close, but not tight enough to suggest she was afraid someone might take it. It was a balance between defense and ease, and it told him more than she could have said out loud. The train slowed for the next stop, the motion rocking everyone forward again. Daniel thought for a brief moment of speaking, just enough to catch her attention, to bridge the gap that had shrunk so suddenly in that stumble. But before he could form the words, she had angled herself toward the doors, leaving a careful buffer of space between her and the nearest passenger. The doors opened with their usual hiss, and the rush of cold air filled the car. She stepped out without looking around, disappearing into the platform crowd with the same ease as water slipping through fingers. Daniel stayed where he was, the noise of the station rising and fading again as the doors closed. He didn't follow. Not yet. But the imprint of her face, worn, hungry, and still holding that quiet, unyielding light settled into him, stubborn as the echo of her voice had been. It was the kind of image that didn't leave when you told it to. The next time he saw her, she was in the same train line, leaning against the side panel by the doors, guitar case propped against one leg. She wasn't singing this time, just humming under her breath, the sound so faint it was almost lost under the steady rattle of the tracks. Daniel stepped into the car to stops after she had boarded, keeping a casual distance, not wanting to spook her. The memory of her voice, clear, aching, and alive in a way most trained singers could never manufacture, still sat heavy in his mind. He waited until the train was moving again, until the shuffle of boarding passengers had settled, before taking a slow step closer. She didn't look up. "That song you sang the other day," he said quietly, his tone even and non-threatening, as though they were just two strangers passing time on a commute. "What was it called?" Her head lifted slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to signal she was paying attention now. "Which song?" she asked, though there was no softness in the question. Her voice was guarded, almost flat, the gospel piece. "You started it low, then took it higher halfway through, stopped everyone cold." The flicker in her gaze was subtle, almost imperceptible, trace of recognition that he had in fact been listening. But just as quickly her guard returned. "It's just an old song," she said, shrugging as if it barely mattered. "You probably heard it before." "Maybe," he replied. "But not like that." The compliment landed in the space between them and stayed there. She didn't acknowledge it, but she didn't turn away either. Her hands adjusted the strap of her bag, her fingers brushing the worn fabric as if to remind herself it was still there. "You play anywhere else?" Daniel asked after a moment. "Clubs? Open mics?" Her eyes sharpened again, suspicion overtaking whatever hint of curiosity had been there. "Why?" He paused, aware he was treading on fragile ground. "Yes." "You're good. Really good." "That's nice," she said, and the words were polite but empty, the kind people used when they wanted the conversation to end. He caught the shift in her posture, the slight angle of her shoulders toward the doors, the readiness in her stance. She was already calculating how quickly she could leave if she had to. "I'm not selling anything," he added, sensing the wall rising higher. "Just wondering if you've thought about singing anywhere other than here." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Sing where I can, that's it." The train began to slow, the brakes screeching as they approached the next station. She reached for her guitar case, swinging it upright with one hand while the other kept her bag close. "You always ask strangers about their lives?" she said, glancing at him now with a half-smirk that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Only the interesting ones," he replied. For a brief second, there was almost a thawsome thing in her expression that wasn't distrust but wasn't quite ease either. It vanished before the doors opened. She stepped out with the first wave of passengers, slipping into the current of people on the platform without looking back. Daniel stayed in the car, watching her retreat until the crowd swallowed her up. It wasn't rejection exactly, but it was clear enough. She wasn't ready to let anyone in. Not yet. And certainly not someone who might have an agenda, even if his was only curiosity for now. Still, the conversation, if it could even be called, that was more than he'd managed the last time. It left him with the sense that this wasn't the last word between them, even if she was determined to make it seem that way. Daniel had been waiting for the right moment since the last time he'd heard her sing. And now, with the rocking of the subway car and the hum of the tracks beneath them, it felt like his window was small but open. She was leaning against the door panel, guitar case balanced against her leg, the strap of a fraying canvas bag looped around one shoulder. Her eyes were on the floor, fixed on nothing in particular, the way people look when they're used to disappearing in plain sight. He stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. His voice was low, conversational, as if he were just making passing small talk. "That song you sang the other day," he said, "is the one that stopped everyone for a minute. What was it?" Head lifted slightly, enough to show she'd heard him, but her gaze didn't fully meet his. "Which song?" she asked, her tone even, almost flat. There was no warmth, no curiosity, just a cautious neutrality that made it clear she was measuring. Him, it was gospel, he said. "Started low, then your voice climbed halfway through. You had the whole car listening." A faint flicker crossed her expression, but she masked it quickly. "It's just something I learned a long time ago," she replied, her voice short-clipped, Old song. I've heard old songs before, he said, keeping his voice gentle. But not like that. Shifted her weight, tightening her grip on the guitar case, as if bracing herself. Compliments weren't rare down here, people. Sometimes said things in passing, but there was a difference between a tossed-off remark and the kind of focus in his tone now. She seemed to feel that difference, and it made her uneasy. You sing anywhere else? He asked after a moment. Clubs? Maybe open mics? Her eyes cut toward him sharply. Why? Because you're good, he answered simply. Really good. That's nice, she said, and the words were polite but distant. The kind people use when they've decided the conversation is over. The train rattled through the next stretch of tunnel, dim light flickering through the windows. Daniel could sense the space between them tightening, not in closeness, but in her retreat. She was pulling back, deciding where the line was, deciding whether to keep standing here or bolt the moment the doors opened. I'm not selling anything, he added, reading her posture. I just think your voice deserves more than these tunnels. She gave a small, almost amused snort. These tunnels are what I've got. For a second, he thought he saw something else in her expressions, something almost like pride. The stubborn kind that kept her from being pitied. It made him slow down, careful not to push. The train began to decelerate, brakes squealing as the next stop came into view. She straightened, adjusting the guitar case and shifting her bag forward. You always ask strangers about their lives? She said, her mouth pulling into a faint half-smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Only the interesting ones, he said, holding her gaze just long enough to see if it would land. If it did, she didn't let it show. The doors slid open with a rush of platform air, and she stepped out with the first wave of passengers, swallowed quickly by the movement of the crowd. Daniel stayed inside the car, watching her weave between commuters until the train lurched forward again. She hadn't given him an answer, not really, but the way she'd paused before walking. Off told him she'd heard more than she wanted to admit. She didn't trust him, probably didn't trust anyone, but the exchange had cracked the surface, even if only by the smallest degree. And for now, that was enough to make him keep coming back. Daniel stood near the turnstiles, watching the last few passengers from his train filter out onto the street. The sharp clang of the gate and the faint smell of oil from the tracks clung to the air. He hesitated, debating whether this was crossing a line, before spotting a man in a navy blue MTA vest leaning against the information booth with a paper cup of coffee in hand. The man had that weary but alert look of someone who'd seen thousands of faces pass by every day, filing them away without thinking. Daniel approached slowly, pulling out the tone he used in business when he needed answers, without making it sound like an interrogation. Excuse me, he said, nodding toward the platform. There's a girl who sings down here sometimes. Plays a little guitar. She's young, maybe 17. I've seen her a couple of times. The attendant raised an eyebrow, giving him a once-over before answering. You talking about the one with the old guitar and the voice that doesn't match her age? That sounds like her? The man gave a short laugh. Yeah, she's been around for a while. A few months, maybe longer. Doesn't bother anyone. Just sings, moves along, doesn't even put out a hat most days. Different from the usual. Daniel leaned slightly closer. Do you know her name? The attendant shook his head. Ah! Never asked. And she's not the kind that hangs around talking, comes and goes. Sometimes you see her every day for a week, then nothing for days, like she's got some other place to be, or maybe just disappears. For a while, that piece stuck with Daniel. Disappears for a while. It made her sound more like a rumor than a person, some fleeting presence that couldn't be pinned down. Has any idea where she stays? The man's expression shifted, quiet caution settling over him. Look, buddy, I don't make a habit of tracking people down here. You see someone enough, you pick up patterns. I can tell you she favors the downtown lines late at night, and she likes the older platforms where the acoustics carry. But where? She sleeps. Could be anywhere. Not really my business. Daniel nodded, accepting that he'd pushed as far as the man was willing to go. Still, the information was something more than he had before. I appreciate it, he said, meaning it. The attendant sipped his coffee, then glanced back toward the platform. She's got one of those voices you don't forget. If you're looking to hear her again, you'll catch her eventually. Just don't spook her. Girl keeps to herself for a reason. That last part landed heavier than Daniel expected. He thanked the man again and stepped back, letting the crowd flow around him. He stayed in the station longer than he needed to, walking the length of the platforms as if she might be tucked away in one of the corners, warming her hands around a paper cup or tuning her guitar. But every bench was empty except for scattered commuters scrolling through their phones. The echoes he heard now were only the mechanical ones, the screech of wheels, the metallic hum of the rails, none of it human. Frustration worked its way into him. But so did something else, the pull of curiosity that had been growing since the first time. He'd heard her voice cut through the chaos. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about the fact that someone like her could exist here in this city. Invisible to nearly everyone, and yet capable of stopping a subway car in its tracks without even trying. As he finally climbed the stairs to street level, the sound of the city rushed. In honking horns, shouted conversations, the rhythm of traffic. He realized he was listening differently now, sifting through the noise for something rare. And he knew he'd be back in this station again, watching, waiting, until he found her. Daniel spotted her before he even stepped fully onto the platform. She was seated on the edge of a worn bench, guitar case open at her feet, not angled toward the crowd like a busker's box, but lying there as if it had been set down without much thought. Her head was slightly bowed, hair falling in uneven strands that hid most of her face. She was halfway through a song, something low and steady, her voice weaving around the sparse chords like it was meant to fill the empty spaces rather than dominate them. The evening rush was tapering off, and the people moving past barely registered her presence. A man in a suit brushed by without looking. A woman with a stroller paused for only a second before continuing toward the stairs. Even the station announcements seemed to speak louder than the audience she had. But Daniel stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dimmer light of the platform, letting his ears settle into the sound she was creating. What? He didn't approach her the way he had before. No questions, no attempts at conversation. Instead, he made his way to the bench a short distance away and sat down, setting his bag beside him. From here, he could hear her clearly, the subtle shifts in her tone, so the way she didn't rush the endings of phrases, as though she understood the value of letting a note fade completely before moving on. Her playing was unpolished but steady, the kind of rhythm that came from practice in uneven conditions. He could tell she was listening to herself, making small adjustments, catching mistakes, and smoothing them without breaking the flow. It wasn't performance for applause. It was something else, more like she was keeping herself anchored with each note. When the song ended, she kept her head lowered for a moment before sliding seamlessly into the next one, an older soul piece that might have been pulled from a dusty record collection decades ago. He knew it instantly. His father had played it on long car rides when Daniel was a boy. Hearing it now, stripped down to just her voice and the gentle strum of the guitar, made it sound raw, more fragile. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. He didn't want the exchange to feel loaded, didn't want her to think there was any expectation attached. So when she reached the soft final chord, he stood, walked the short distance to her case, and dropped a folded bill inside without a word. She didn't stop playing. Her eyes flickered up for the briefest second, catching his, but her hands kept moving. He saw the recognition. She knew who he was from the last conversation, and she knew he had sought her out again. But she didn't speak, didn't nod, didn't thank him. She just shifted slightly on the bench, her fingers tightening around the guitar neck as she began another song. Daniel returned to his seat, listening again. He could feel the weight of the choice he'd made not to push, not to lead with. The talk of recording studios or contracts or anything that might send her retreating. For now, the silence between them felt like the right kind of distance. One that left room for her to decide if she wanted to bridge it. The station clock ticked on, a train roared in, and then another left. Still, he sat there, letting her voice layer itself over the sounds of the platform. The more he listened, the more certain he became. She didn't need convincing of her talent. She needed proof that someone could see it without trying to take it from her. And that, he decided, would be the only thing he gave her tonight. The train had just pulled out of the station, leaving behind a stillness broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant screech of another train far down the tunnel. Maya was halfway through a song, one of those slow, winding melodies that seemed to fold in on itself, when the sharp metallic snap cut through the air. The sound made her wince, her fingers freezing mid-chord. A single string dangled loose from the headstock, coiling like a spent spring. She muttered something under her breath, low, sharp, almost swallowed by the station's background noise, but her frustration was written clearly in the small tightening of her shoulders. The guitar sat awkwardly in her lap now, incomplete. She plucked at the remaining strings, testing, but the absence was too glaring. The fullness of the sound was gone, replaced by a thin, uneven echo that made the song feel broken. A couple of commuters slowed as they passed, curiosity flickering in their expressions, but they kept moving. The moment passed for them as quickly. As it had arrived, for Maya, it lingered. She set the guitar down gently beside her, rubbing at the back of her neck, in the silence that followed. The emptiness of the platform seemed louder. Daniel had been leaning against a column nearby, his hands in the pockets of his wool coat. He had watched the moment unfold, feeling that small pang you get when you witness something fragile give way. He took a few steps toward her, not too close, his voice low so it wouldn't carry. "Strings break," he said, almost conversationally. "Happens to everyone, sometimes at the worst time." She glanced up briefly, eyes narrowing, as if weighing whether to respond. "Yeah, well, mine don't get replaced so easy," she muttered, fingers absently tracing the worn edge of the guitar's body. Daniel hesitated for a beat, then pulled his wallet from his coat pocket. "I know a shop a couple blocks from here," he said. "I could get you a new set. No strings attached." He let the faintest hint of a smile slip in at his own word choice, though it earned no more than a faint lift of her eyebrow. Her gaze shifted to the open guitar case, where a handful of coins and a couple of crumpled bills sat. "I'm fine," she said, shaking her head. "I'll figure it out. It's not a big deal," Daniel replied. 5 minutes in the store? You'd be back to playing tonight." She met his eyes then, and there was a firmness in hers that surprised him. "You don't get it. I can't owe anyone. It's not for something like this." He held her stare for a moment, then nodded once, slowly letting the offer fade without pushing. "All right," he said simply. He slid his wallet back into his pocket and stepped away, giving her space again. Maya exhaled quietly, turning the guitar over in her hands. She began retuning the remaining strings, adjusting her fingers to play without the missing one. The sound was thinner, but she worked with it, reshaping the chords to fit what she had left. Daniel stood at a distance, listening as she began again, not the same song she'd been playing before, but something faster, more percussive, as if daring the guitar to keep up despite its loss. Her pride, he realized, was more than just a wall. It was a shield, whatever it had cost her to survive up to now. It was clear she wasn't about to let anyone, even someone offering something small, chip away at it. As the next train pulled in, he stayed where he was, letting her music, altered and imperfect, fill the space between them. She didn't need his help tonight, but the sound of that broken string had lodged itself in his mind, and he knew he wouldn't forget it. The night had settled into that in-between hour when the subway seemed to breathe slower. The rush of trains less frantic, the platform scattered with only the occasional commuter. Maya sat cross-legged on the bench, her guitar resting lightly against her knee. She had found a pocket of rhythm that worked around the missing string, turning its absence into something deliberate, the way some singers leaned into a crack in their voice. Her tone carried through the still air, low and warm, wrapping itself around the dim hum of the station lights. She was halfway through an old blues tune when a shadow stretched across her case. Maya glanced up to see a man standing there mid-30s, sun-weathered skin, hair tucked beneath a knit cap. He had a guitar strapped across his back, the kind with a scuffed finish and stickers along the side. There was a loose grin on his face, the kind that seemed to ask without asking if he could join in. Before she could decide how to respond, he unhooked the strap, slid the guitar into place, and without a word, began to pick out a line beneath her chords. It was soft at first, just enough to lace around the edges of her sound. Eyebrow but didn't stop playing. The melody shifted naturally, as though the song had been waiting for another voice all along. He filled in the spaces where her missing string left gaps, the harmony making her voice sound fuller, brighter. She adjusted her strumming, giving him room to weave in flourishes. It was unplanned, and for a moment it felt like a gamble too. Strangers trying to find the same rhythm without speaking. But the longer it went on, the more it settled into something effortless. A couple of passers-by slowed, drawn in by the unexpected pairing. One woman leaned against the railing, smiling faintly. A man in a leather jacket paused on his way to the stairs, tapping his foot in time, the platform usually indifferent to. Her presence began to shift toward her. The crowd was small at first, then grew as people stepped closer, pulled in by the blend of their playing. Daniel was already there, leaning against a column at the far end. When the other guitarist joined in, he straightened slightly, his attention sharpening. He could hear the way the stranger's accompaniment unlocked something in her delivery, confidence that wasn't loud, but settled deep in the way she carried each note. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his phone, and quietly began to film. Through the screen, he caught the small details. Her closed eyes as she leaned into a high phrase, the way her left hand moved up the fretboard with instinct rather than calculation. The stranger's quick glance toward her every few beats to check they were still in sync. It wasn't. Polished not by any industry standard, but there was a rawness, in a sense that this was music for its own sake, not for approval. When they reached the end of the song, the last chord lingered longer than expected, the echo hanging in the tunnel before fading. The small crowd clapped, a few people even cheering. Maya opened her eyes, looking faintly surprised at the reaction. The man with the knit cap gave her a nod, as if to say good run, then swung his guitar back over his shoulder. Without waiting for thanks or introducing himself, he disappeared into the stairwell, leaving her alone with the sound of coins and a couple of folded bills being dropped into her case. Maya glanced down at the money, then up at the people dispersing. She didn't look toward Daniel, though he was still filming, the phone now lowered slightly as he studied her expression. There was no smile, but there was a flicker of something in awareness that, for a few minutes, the city had stopped to hear her. Daniel slipped the phone back into his pocket, the recording saved without a word. This wasn't the kind of moment you could recreate in a studio on command. It was unplanned, unpolished, and real, and for him. That made it worth more than any stage performance could ever be. Where Daniel sat at his kitchen table well past midnight, the apartment quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the occasional hiss of the radiator. The subway clip played again on his phone, its tinny speakers doing no justice to the depth he'd heard in person. Even through the rumble of trains and the murmur of the crowd, Maya's voice rose, clear and unforced. There was no pretense. No affectation, just a tone that reached straight through the noise, as if the world had forgotten to teach her the boundaries of how far a song could travel. He hesitated before forwarding it. For years he had been reluctant to send anything to Aaron Price without polishing it first. Aaron had been his most trusted sound engineer for decades, sharp-eared, meticulous, and never one to sugarcoat his opinions. If the man didn't hear something worth pursuing, he'd say so in the kind of blunt way that left no room for argument. But Daniel knew this was different. The message he typed was simple. Heard this on the subway tonight. No setup, no mics, no prep. Just her. He attached the clip, took a breath, and hit send. 15 minutes later, his phone buzzed. Flashed, "Call me now." Daniel stepped into his study, closing the door behind him before dialing. Aaron answered on the first ring, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who just stumbled onto something unexpected. "Who is she?" he asked without greeting. "That's the problem," Daniel said. "I don't know. Saw her twice. Before, never got a name." There was a pause, followed by the faint sound of the clip playing in the background on Aaron's end. "You're telling me this is raw subway audio? No filters, no reverb, nothing?" "Phone mic only, Daniel." Confirmed. Aaron exhaled sharply, a sound halfway between disbelief and appreciation. The control she has most people with a setup couldn't pull that in this kind of noise. Her pitch barely wavers, and she's shaping her vowels like she's been doing it for 20 years? You can't teach that. He stopped, searching for the right word. That's lived in tone. Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching the shadows move on the ceiling. I thought you'd hear. You'd hear it? I felt it, Aaron said. She's not trained, or at least not recently, but that's part of it. There's no studio polish. He broke off again, as if trying not to ruin the impression with too much analysis. You need to find her. I'm serious, Daniel. Don't let this one slip. Daniel was quiet for a moment, his mind tracing over the last few encounters her. Vanishing into the crowd, the broken string, the duet with the street musician. She hadn't once looked like someone waiting for discovery. If anything, she seemed to go out of her way to stay unseen. She won't be easy to approach, he said finally. Then don't approach her like a label guy, Aaron replied. You walk in with contracts or promises, she'll vanish. Talk to her like a person. Figure out what she needs before you tell her what you want. Daniel let the words settle. He had spent years in boardrooms convincing people of opportunities they didn't know they needed. But this wasn't that. This was something more fragile. He couldn't barge in with the weight of his industry behind him. It would crush the thing that made her worth hearing in the first place. I'll find her, he said, though he wasn't entirely sure how yet. Aaron's tone softened, though the urgency remained. And when you do, record her exactly where she is. Don't pull her into a studio first. The sound she has right now, in that space, it's gold. They ended the call, and Daniel sat for a long while with the phone still in his hand. Outside, the city kept moving the same way it had every night. Somewhere in the miles of tunnels beneath it, Maya might still be singing, her voice carrying to no one in particular. He knew now that he wouldn't be able to let it stay that way. The station was busier than usual for the late afternoon, air thick with the sound of trains grinding into the platforms and the shuffling of commuters heading home. Maya was seated in her usual spot near the tiled column, her guitar balanced. Across her lap, the case open at her feet with a few coins and crumpled bills scattered inside. She was halfway through a slow, aching rendition of an old Billie Holiday song, her voice weaving through the noise in a way that made certain people turn their heads even if they didn't stop. Daniel stood just far enough back to watch. Had been circling this decision for days, telling himself that timing mattered, that he needed to wait for the right moment. But the truth was, he had been stalling. Approaching her meant risking the balance she might reject him outright. She might disappear for good, or worse, he might be wrong about her. When the last note hung in the air, and the murmur of the crowd began to swallow it, he stepped forward. His coat brushed against his legs, the weight of the card in his pocket feeling heavier than it should. You've got something rare, he said, his voice low enough to be heard only by her. Maya looked up slowly, her expression caught somewhere between suspicion and indifference. Her fingers tightened around the guitar neck. I'm not selling anything, she said. I'm not buying anything, Daniel replied. My name's Daniel Hartman. I run a record label. I've been listening to you for a while. The shift in her posture was subtle but immediate. Her shoulders drew in, the guardedness in her eyes sharpening. Yeah, sure you do, she said flatly. That's what they all say. Next comes the pitch about how I can make it big if I just sign something right now, right? I'm not here to trick you, Daniel said, keeping his tone even. I'm telling you because I think you should know what you have. Most people spend their lives trying to fake. They never get close. She let out a short, humorless laugh. You just happened to stumble across it in the subway? I didn't stumble, Daniel said. I came back here because I wanted to hear you again, and because I think the world should hear you too. Maya's gaze stayed fixed on him, searching his face for the catch. She had met people before, who led with kindness and followed with an angle. The subway was full of them, smooth talkers who needed a favor, hustlers who dressed their greed in charm. His clothes were too clean, his voice too calm, didn't belong in this tunnel, and that made him more dangerous in her mind. Look, she said, her voice cooling further, I've been fine without strangers telling me what I should do. I don't need saving. I don't need someone else controlling my life. Daniel nodded, accepting the blow without flinching. Fair enough, he said quietly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, cream-colored business card. If you ever change your mind, or if you just want to talk about music, call me. No strings. She didn't reach for it, set it gently on the edge of her guitar. Case then stepped back. "Enjoy your night, Maya," he said, surprising her with the use of her name. He had overheard it once, weeks ago, when a kid had dropped a coin into her case and called her by it. He didn't wait for her to respond, just turned and walked toward the stairs, his coat disappearing into the crowd. She stared at the card for a long time after he was gone, the neat lettering stark against the worn felt of her case. "Pick it up." "Not yet." The train roared into the station, drowning out the last trace of his presence. But the conversation lingered, a thread she couldn't quite pull loose. The building didn't look like what she had pictured. She'd expected glass towers, revolving doors, something cold and polished that would make her feel like an intruder the second she stepped inside. Instead, the address led her to a narrow, brick-front space on a quiet side street in Lower Manhattan. The windows were tall but dusty. The lettering on the door hand-painted and faded, Hartman sound. It looked less like a corporate office and more like a place that had been part of the city for decades. A little worn at the edges but still standing. Maya lingered on the opposite sidewalk for a long time, her fingers hooked through the straps of her backpack. She had been turning the card over in her mind for days, sometimes slipping it out from the pocket of her coat and staring at the name, as if it might reveal something. Even looked him up on a borrowed phone at the library, scrolling through old articles that painted him as some kind of industry ghost. Famous once, but long gone from the headlines. It made her no less suspicious. The morning air was cold, sharp, enough to sting her cheeks, and she told herself for the 5th time that she could still walk away. No one was expecting her. If this was a scam, she'd see the warning signs, and if it wasn't, well, she didn't even know what to do with that possibility. She crossed the street slowly, her boots clicking against the cracked pavement. When she pushed the door open, a soft chime rang overhead. The inside smelled faintly of coffee and something metallic, like warm wires. The walls were lined with framed black and white photos of musicians she didn't recognize, each one caught mid-performance. There were no reception desks, no plastic chairs. Just a couch that had seen better days and a tall counter cluttered with papers, cables, and 2 mismatched coffee mugs. From somewhere in the back, she heard footsteps. Daniel appeared a moment later in the same long wool coat she remembered from the subway. His expression flickered from surprise to something more measured, like he didn't want to startle her. "You came," he said simply. "I'm not staying long," she replied, her voice clipped. "Why?" She kept her backpack in front of her, one strap looped around her wrist like a tether. "That's fine," Daniel said, stepped aside, gesturing toward the couch. "Sit if you want, or don't. No pressure." She stayed standing, her eyes scanning the room. There was equipment here, microphones, cables, a couple of instruments leaning against the wall, but it didn't look staged. It looked like a place someone actually worked, not a set meant to impress. "I don't know what you think you heard." "Down there," she said finally, "but I'm not some project you can just pick up?" Daniel nodded, as if he'd been expecting the pushback. "I don't want to pick you up," he said. "I want to hear you without a train screaming. Over your head, that's all. No contracts, no fine print. Just you and a mic. If you hate it, you walk out, and I never bother you again." The straightforwardness caught her off guard. She had been ready for the sales pitch, the promises, the too-slick charm. Instead, his voice was steady, almost tired, like someone who had stopped trying to force things a long time ago. "If I say no?" she asked. "Then you say no," he replied, shrugging. "I'll keep riding the subway, and maybe I'll hear you again someday." Silence settled between them. Maya shifted her weight, glancing at the door. She didn't trust. Asili Shea had learned the cost of that young, but she also knew she'd come here for a reason, even if she couldn't name it yet. "I'll sing," she said at last, her voice low, but just once. Daniel smiled faintly, not in victory, but in acknowledgement. "Once is all I'm asking." He stepped back, giving her space, and motioned toward a small recording booth. In the corner, she followed him in cautiously, her backpack still in hand, every muscle ready to leave if anything felt wrong. The glass door clicked shut behind her, and for the first time in a long while, the noise of the city was gone. The recording booth was small, its walls covered in panels of gray foam that seemed to swallow sound and make the air feel heavier. A single stool sat in the middle, angled toward a tall microphone suspended from an arm that looked almost delicate under the dim light. Maya stood just inside the door, her backpack still slung over one shoulder, her eyes moving over the equipment, like it might bite. The glass window separated her from Daniel, who was already in the control room adjusting knobs on a panel covered in rows of glowing lights. He didn't rush her, simply looked up once, gave a nod of acknowledgement, and then returned his attention to the console. A younger man with close-cropped hair someone Maya hadn't seen before was leaning over his shoulder, pointing at a few settings. She guessed this was the sound engineer he had mentioned. "You can leave your bag in the corner." Daniel's voice came through a small speaker near her head, smooth but distant. She shook her head without realizing the glass would make it harder for him to see. "I'm fine," she said, her voice a little tight. There was a faint chuckle through the speaker, not mocking, just amused. "All right," Daniel said. "When you're ready, we'll start with something you already." "No. Doesn't matter what, just sing it the way you would down in the station." Maya swallowed, her fingers brushing against the strap of her bag. The room felt too clean, too still. In the subway, she had the rumble of trains, the shuffle of feet, the constant hum that wrapped around her voice like a blanket. Here, every sound she made would be naked, hanging in the air with nowhere to hide. She took a slow breath and stepped toward the mic. The metal was cool under her fingertips as she adjusted it slightly downward. Her eyes flicked toward the window where Daniel was watching, not with the sharp focus of someone looking for flaws, but with the quiet patience of someone waiting for something to happen. Her voice started small, almost tentative. She slipped into an old gospel tune, one she had sung countless times when she needed to ground herself. The first line trembled, but by the second, the muscle memory took over. Her shoulders eased. Her breathing found its rhythm. The mic caught the depth in her tone, the way her voice seemed to pull from somewhere older than she was, carrying a texture that was both worn and unbreakable. In the control room, Daniel leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing in the way a craftsman does when recognizing rare work. The sound engineer's eyebrows lifted, and he glanced at Daniel with a look that said more than words could. The mix on the board wasn't perfect. There was no polish yet, but even raw. The voice filled the room like it had been waiting years for this moment. Maya kept singing, her eyes closed now, no longer thinking about the walls or the glass or the strangers on the other side. It was just the song, the way the notes climbed and dipped, the way certain words caught in her throat and came out richer. For it, the booth didn't feel like a trap anymore. It felt like the only place in the world where the sound could stretch its arms without bumping into anything. When the last note faded, she stayed still, the echo in her head lingering longer than she expected. Slowly, she opened her eyes and looked through the glass. Daniel's expression had shifted, still calm, but there was something in it now, a kind of gravity. The speaker clicked on. "That," he said, his voice softer than before, "is exactly what I heard in the station. Only now I know I wasn't imagining it." Maya shrugged lightly, unsure how to respond. Compliments didn't feel real to her, not when they came from people she barely knew. "It's just a song," she murmured. Daniel shook his head. "No," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It's more than that." She looked away, pretending to adjust the mic again, but part of her held on to his words.
Right.
They felt dangerous, like they could start building something inside her if she wasn't careful. In the control room, Daniel and the engineer exchanged a glance that carried its own conversation. For Daniel, this wasn't just about a voice anymore. It was about the rare chance to be part of something genuine again, to create without the noise of the industry drowning it out. For Maya, though she didn't know it yet, this was the first step toward a life that would look nothing like the one she had been surviving. The stage lights were warmer than she expected, softer too, not the blinding interrogation beams she'd imagined from watching performances on television. They painted her in a gold glow that made the edges of the crowd blur, leaving only the shapes of faces turned toward her. The murmur of voices faded as she stepped to the microphone, the strap of her guitar digging gently into her shoulder. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. She thought they would shake. The room was nothing like the tunnels she had known. Smell of metal dust, no flicker of fluorescent bulbs, no echo of trains pressing through the walls. Instead, there was a quiet anticipation, a held breath that belonged to everyone in the room. Maya's name had been printed on the flyer by the door. People had come here to hear her, not because she happened to be part of the background noise on their commute, but because they chose to be. Daniel was somewhere near the back, leaning against the wall, his expression calm but unreadable. She had learned not to look for reassurance in his face when she sang. He listened in a way that didn't interfere, as if to remind her the song was hers alone. The sound engineer from the studio sat at the mixing board, nodding to the rhythm as if he already knew how this would go. She adjusted the mic slightly, glanced down at her guitar, and let her fingers find the first chord. The sound was clean, clear, and immediate, nothing like the way it bounced off tile and steel in the subway. Her voice followed, low at first, finding the shape of the melody before letting it grow. She wasn't trying to fill a space anymore. She was speaking directly into the silence the audience had given her. The song she chose wasn't one of the ones Daniel had suggested. It was one she had kept for herself until now, a piece she'd written under the stairwell months before they'd met. The lyrics weren't complicated, just plain words about leaving and staying, about finding places you could live in, even if they weren't safe. Each verse felt like stepping through a door she had built herself, one she knew would close gently behind her when she was done. As she sang, she caught glimpses of faces in the crowd, someone closing their eyes, someone leaning forward, slightly, as if to catch every word. There was no shuffling of feet, no tapping of impatient fingers, no bodies pressing toward an exit. The room stayed still, and in that stillness, she found the same thing she had been chasing in the tunnels, a space where the song could breathe. When the last note hung in the air, there was a pause, a beat of pure quiet before the applause began. It rolled toward her like a wave, not rushed or polite, but solid, carrying a weight she hadn't felt before. She gave a small nod in thanks, not sure her voice would hold if she tried to speak. After the set, she packed her guitar in its worn case, the same one she had carried through the stations all winter. People came up to say they enjoyed it, to ask where she'd be playing next, to tell her she should record more. She smiled, said thank you, but didn't make promises. She had learned the value of keeping some things her own. When she finally stepped outside, the night air felt cool against her skin. Daniel offered her a ride, but she shook her head. Wanted the subway. It wasn't about habit, it was about sound. Down there in the long tunnels and low platforms, songs carried differently. They stretched out, wrapped around pillars, folded back in on themselves. She liked the way they returned to her, changed but still hers. She descended the familiar steps, the rumble of a train growing louder as she reached the platform. People stood scattered along the edge, none of them paying her any attention. She set her case down, opened it, and let the first chord ring out. The tile walls caught it, sent it back to her with that soft distortion she'd learned to love. Some songs belonged on stages, in rooms filled with people who came to listen. Others belonged here, drifting past strangers who didn't know her, who might never remember her face. Both were true, and both were hers to keep.